So with that, let's turn to the 11th chapter of the book that we've been studying for the last several weeks, few months, the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 11. And it's going to contain some rather difficult and confusing passages. You can see, if some of you might be familiar with the passage, the chapter, some of you may not be. I know some of you have been waiting ever since we started 1 Corinthians for me to get to chapter 11 so I could address the issue of long hair on men. And we'll be covering that today, so that should keep you from falling asleep. But there's not a verse in this chapter. While some of them might be a little difficult for us to parse out and to put into a cultural setting today, there's not a verse that's not relevant for today. In fact, this could be one of the most relevant sections in the whole book. And he starts off, he says, imitate me just as I imitate Christ. And we've seen this word previously. The word that is translated imitate is the word mimetes. Our word mimic comes from it. And he's basically saying, mimic me as you see me mimicking Jesus. And there are some that think that this should go with, the chapter and verse divisions were done by men several centuries after the Bible was written. And so they're not inspired, and they're just done by well-meaning men that were trying to make it easier for us to do, turn to various reference points within the Bible. And some think that this passage, this verse should probably go with the closing of chapter 10, when he was, talking about how Jesus, talking about the rights that we have as Christians, the privileges that we have, freedoms we have as Christians, but love rules over those. Love trumps whatever freedoms we would have in Christ. And then he's closing that section out by saying, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Could be. And then others think that it's well placed at the beginning of chapter 11, as he says for the introduction and what's going to follow in chapter 11. I don't think it really matters. I don't think the context is that much of a shift. I think what's been going on in Paul's mind for the last several chapters is going to continue on through the end of this chapter. But he's going to talk about the theme of primarily what we're going to be looking at this morning. These 16 verses are going to be talking about the subject of authority. And we all at some time or another find ourselves in position of authorities. I mean, sometimes it's in ministry, whether it be as the role of the senior pastor or a worship leader or a Sunday school teacher or the head of a ministry. We sometimes find ourselves in that position of authority. As husbands, we find ourselves as the heads of the homes. As parents, we find ourselves as authority over the children. We all at some point or another find ourselves in that sort of a place. As older siblings, we find ourselves, yes, God did make me the boss of you. We find ourselves in those kind of roles quite often. And the question is, can we echo what Paul just said here in verse 1? As we find ourselves, and he's going to be talking about the place of authority, and he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Can we say, yeah, imitate me as I imitate Christ? And then we say that to whoever it is that we might find ourselves in authority over. Once there was a perfect man, and he married a perfect woman. And they had a perfect wedding, and their life together was, of course, very perfect. And it was one snowy, stormy Christmas Eve. This perfect couple were driving along in their perfect car. It was a Lamborghini Huracan, of course. And they were going along this winding road, and they noticed someone on the roadside in distress. And being the perfect couple, they stopped to help. Well, there stood Santa Claus with a whole huge bundle of toys. And not wanting to disappoint any of the children on Christmas Eve, the perfect couple loaded up Santa and his toys in their little two-seater Lamborghini. And they started this impossible feat. It would have been an impossible feat were not for the fact that they were perfect, to deliver the toys to all the children of the world on Christmas Eve. And unfortunately, the road conditions, the weather deteriorated, and the perfect couple and Santa Claus had an accident. Only one of them survived. Question is, which one? Who was the survivor? Well, the answer is the perfect woman, because we all know there's no such thing as Santa Claus, and there's no such thing as a perfect man. So it had to have been the woman. I don't get any amens. Oh, wait, that's not the end of it. So if there's no perfect man and no Santa Claus, then the perfect woman had to have been the one that was driving. And thus, that explains the car accident in the first place. Can I get an amen? You know, one of the strongest evidences that we have of a creation, of the Creator, is the creation. And as we look at this thing called the universe, this thing we call creation, it drips of the handiwork of a creator. You know, it is what today the scientists like to call intelligent design. And we're all very thankful that that's the case, because God is a God of structure, and the universe displays that very clearly. And this would be a pretty scary place were he not a God of structure. And we're probably all familiar with this, you know, this day it's the postmodern, or some people would say the postmodern cultural maxim of question authority. And I saw a bumper sticker not too long ago where the bumper sticker said, question authority, and then underneath that it said, just ask me anything. And, you know, because I'm the authority on it. And so you can just ask me. You can question me all you want to. And really, that's when we say that we want to question authority, that's really what we're saying. Because we don't want to have somebody being the boss over us, because we want to be the boss. And as I said, we usually love structure. And we're grateful that God is a God of structure. We like structure in our society also, usually. I mean, we're very thankful when we hear that the police have arrested a child molester. And so we're very thankful that we have an authority structure that includes the police department, and they keep the laws. But then we're not so thankful whenever we look in our rearview mirror and we see the lights flashing. You know, so usually we're thankful for that, but it's not always the case. But it's important for us to know that the necessity for that structure exists, whether we're thankful for it or whether we appreciate it or not. If we didn't have it, I mean, without order, there would be chaos. And we think the world's chaotic now, just think what it would be without the structure system. And so he says, in verse 2, he says, now, most of Paul's various subjects that he's addressed in the book so far begin with a rebuke. And this is kind of a rare entrance that we have in verse 2, where he says, now I praise you, brethren. We don't see that a whole lot in this book, because most of what he's doing is correcting. But he says, I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. Now, some traditions are good and some traditions are not. I think we may not agree on what all falls on each side of the equation, but we would all agree with that some are good and some are bad. Jesus, in the book of Mark, he addresses this subject with the Pharisees. In verse 9, he said to them, this is Mark chapter 7, verse 9, he says, all too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your traditions. So you got your traditions that you allow to supersede the word of God, he says in verse 9. And then verse 13 says, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition which you have handed down. They had this oral tradition that had been passed down from generation to generation to generation. And they would teach that. The rabbis would teach it to their students, and they would grow up, and then they would become rabbis, and then they would teach it to their students, and all the time it was being taught to the people. And this oral tradition had become so sacrosanct in that culture that it actually superseded the word. And Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees for that. Mark Twain, 150 years ago, he said, the less there is to justify a traditional custom, the harder it is to get rid of it. And that's what Jesus had dealt with in the first century. And I think that we can also probably identify things in our own current lives that would fall into that category as well. Maybe you came from a very traditional type of church, and they had certain ways that they did things and certain ways that they would not do things, and it was very rigid and very regulated, and you felt like it's too restrictive or too confining, and so you want to be away from that sort of traditionalism. But then you even take a non-traditional church like Calvary Chapel. We got our traditions. We got traditions here that sometimes can become, well, we've always done it this way before, and so we're never going to vary from it. And so, but traditions in and of themselves are not necessarily bad. It just depends on what the tradition is, right? And so what Paul is, he says, I'm praising you that you've kept that tradition which I delivered to you, and the one that he's delivering to them is a good one. He says, but I want you to know, this is the good tradition that he's delivering to them, I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of every woman is man, and the head of every Christ is God. Now, the understanding of this verse is going to divide many Christians into one of two camps. Okay, there are two terms that you may or may not be familiar with. The first one is what's called egalitarian or egalitarianism. And this dictionary definition is relating to or behaving in the principle that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunities. So regardless of a person's social status, regardless of a person's, and when we bring it into the church, it's usually brought upon gender distinctions that men and women are created equal. And Jesus said that there is no man nor woman, we're just all one in Christ. And so therefore, all roles within the church should be equally done by men and women. That's usually what would be called an egalitarian, or we could say maybe a hard egalitarian position. And then the second one is what's known as complementarian or complementarianism. And don't get hung up on the terms, okay? I mean, there's guys spent a lot of time in college to come up with them, and they like using these terms. So don't get hung up on the terms. Just kind of look at what we're talking about, what they mean. And complementarianism is a theological view that in some denominations of Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism, and Islam, that men and women have different but complementary roles and responsibilities in marriage, family life, and religious leadership. And so they're not. They're equal but different. They're equal but not the same, and that's one of the things that has always been kind of confusing with the two terms, because they seem to don't take that into consideration. But egalitarianism is there's no distinctions, and so anything a man can do in the church, a woman can do, and vice versa. We just don't even think of look at whether they're boys or girls. Whereas complementarianism says, no, there are certain roles that have been given within the church and the home that are intended for the ladies, and there are certain roles within the church and the home that are intended for men. And the two together complement each other. I think a very large part of the disagreement between these that comes from a misunderstanding of what the Bible means when it uses the word submission. I mean, that's kind of the buzz phrase. That word is the one that's where the dividing line comes, right, on this whole discussion when it brings up submission. And so I think it's important for us to understand what submission is not and what it is. When we talk about how the Bible uses the word, and when it talks about we're to submit one to another, or the women are supposed to submit to their wives, submit to their husbands, or whatever, when we're looking at this word within the confines of the Bible, let's look at what it doesn't mean so that we can understand also what it does mean. And what it does not mean is that, let's take it into the realm of a marriage, for example. I've had women say, so what, when we say, show them what the Bible says about submission, they say, so you're just telling me I should be a doormat. Just let my husband walk all over me. And there's no place in the Bible where that's instructed. No, that's not what submission is. No place where anybody is called to be a doormat in Scripture. But what it is is the role of submission is to be a helper. In the Old Testament, there's the word ezer, and we're going to look at it more when we get to verse 9. But this complementary role within the family, where the husband is said to be the head of the home, as the verse just says here, and the wife is to be in submission to the husband, that the two of them, the wife was given to the husband to be a helper. That can sound condescending, but just hang with me, okay? We're going to get to a fuller explanation of it, as I said, in a little bit. Another thing that submission is not is that it's an action. You know, I've had this said to me before too. Well, the Bible says that I got to submit, so by golly, I'm going to submit. You know, but it's almost like I'm standing down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside. You know, or sitting down on the outside, and because I'm going to do it because that's what the Bible says. I got to do it. You know, that's not what submission is. It's not an action. But what it is, and the dictionary definition of the word hupotasso, submission in the Bible, is a voluntary attitude of cooperating. It's a responsibility and assuming responsibility and carrying a burden. Submission is never forced or coerced. There's no place in the Bible where it says that the husband should tell their wives to submit to them. You must submit to me because I'm the head of the home, so your role is to submit to me. There's no place in the Bible where the husbands are told to do that. It's never forced or coerced. Another thing that submission is not is obedience, and here's what I mean by that. It doesn't mean that you are to obey your husband. I had a guy come to church several years ago, and I was talking to him. He was just visiting. He was the son of a lady in the church. And so I was talking to him after the service, and he was kind of telling me a story. And he said he was married, but he said they're separated now, and that his wife had brought out a victim protection order against him. And I said, oh, really? Why is that? And he said, well, it really kind of boils down to this, that she just won't obey me. And we were sitting at my desk, and I had my Bible open on the desk when he said this, and I just kind of, I just took my Bible and turned it around and slid it across the desk to him, and it says, could you show me someplace in here where it says that she should? And she said, well, it's in there. It's, you're the pastor. You should know the stuff. It's in there. It says that the wife's supposed to obey her husband. And so I turned to Ephesians 5, and I read where it says, wives, submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. And he said, yeah, that's it. That's the verse. And I said, it doesn't say obey. It says submit. And he kind of had a detached look in his eyes at that point. And so then I explained to him what the word submission means. And what it does not mean is obey. And I've had wives come to me where their husband has told them that they're supposed to obey him because he's the head of the home. And then so part of the way that's demonstrated is for them to do things that were ungodly, like watching movies that were not appropriate, and that sort of thing. The husband would make the wife watch that with them because that was a turn on to the husband. And they asked me, do I have to do that? And I said, no, that's sin. That's what the Bible calls sin. You should never watch something that is condemned by the Bible. You should never put yourself in that kind of role, and it would never fall under the role of submission. That's not what you're called to do. It's not obedience. And fourthly, it's not manipulation. I'm sorry. What it is, it's not obedience, but what it is it says in Philippians 2:3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. That's what we're told to do, Philippians 2:3, and it even puts it in the context about if you get any consolation by what Jesus has done, then fulfill my joy, Paul says, by being like-minded. Do the same thing Jesus did, and that's what Jesus did. So if we're going to follow Jesus, that's what we would do. We don't do anything out of selfish ambition or conceit, but we would always esteem others greater than ourselves. And the last thing that I want to say that submission is not is manipulation. And here's what I mean by that. I've even read some Christian books that were really pretty good Christian books, except for the fact that they kind of, at least subtly, brought this in. And they say that, wives, if you submit to your husbands, here's what's going to happen. If you submit to your husbands, then the Lord's going to start working on your husband, and he's going to start feeling guilty for the way that he's treating you, and he's going to start treating you better. And so if you really want him to be a better husband, then start submitting to him, and then he'll be a better husband. Sounds like manipulation to me, I mean, while the premise may be true, that may be a dynamic that works, that's not what the Bible teaches. Because submission is not a way to manipulate somebody that's in authority into being better. It's not manipulation, but what it is trusting God for the outcome. As he says in 1 Peter chapter 2, we'll start with verse 21, but this is after he tells them to be submissive to each other. He says, you slaves, be submissive to your masters, and so forth. And then he says, starting with verse 21, for to this you were called, and he's talking to everybody there. Everybody that's reading Peter's letter is talking to all of them. For this you were called because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. And then quoting from Isaiah, he says, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. This is what Jesus did. When he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but he committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. So what he's saying is, when Jesus was going through his passion, as we call it, when he was going through his suffering, when he was taking to himself the sins of the world, he was bearing the penalty for our sins, and he was experiencing all this injustice, he didn't lash back at his accusers. He didn't lash back at his persecutors and prosecutors. What he did instead was he just gave it into the Father's hands. Even when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? What he was saying is, God, I can't connect the dots here. I don't understand what's going on here. It seems like you're not there. I feel like you're not there. But he still trusted that he was. And that's what Jesus was in full submission. Here's God who created the universe into existence by the power of his word. He is in full submission to the Father. That's what submission looks like. It's for the sake of order, or we could say for structure. God is a God of order. He is a God of structure. We can look at the universe and see that to be true. Now, is God the Father superior to God the Son? No, they're both God. He's not superior. It says in John 5:18, therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, meaning the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees and Sadducees. They sought all the more to kill him because he not only broke the Sabbath, what they meant. He didn't break the Sabbath. What he broke was their tradition about the Sabbath, the oral tradition about what keeping the Sabbath looked like. He broke that. And also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So even his enemies understood that Jesus was saying that he was equal with the Father. So the Father isn't superior to it. It has nothing, submission and authority has nothing to do with superiority or inferiority. Nothing. If you're driving down the street and you see the lights flashing in your rearview mirror and you pull over and officer comes up to the door and says, can I see your license and registration? You can't say no. Well, you can. I don't recommend it. It would be against the law, and it's probably not going to go well from you from that point forward, because you have to submit to that authority. Now, there are limits on what that authority can do, but that doesn't make him better. He may not be better. He may be a bad cop, but he has that authority to ask you for if you're driving a motor vehicle, he has the authority to ask you for your license and registration. Okay? Here's what it boils down to. If we look at a body with no head, it's dead. Even chickens look like they're still alive when they lose their head, but they're not. And so a body with no head is dead, but a body with two heads is a monster. And so if we understand that dynamic, then we can understand the structure of what God has involved here. A body with two heads is freakish, where one with no head is not even alive. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. This is verse 4. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. And if a woman is not covered, let her be also shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, then let her be covered. Now, some of you may be familiar with this passage, may be familiar with the understanding and the teaching of it. Some of you might be going, wait, what? What is he saying here? Ray Stedman, who was a guy like a generation before me, so long time ago, and he had pastored during the 50s and 60s and then into even when he passed away in the early 90s. And he was addressing, he was talking about, back in the 50s when all the women wore hats to church. And after a little bit of time in the 60s, that started kind of not being a thing. And so it was somewhat of a scandal for the women to start coming to church without wearing hats. And so he's writing with that context, and he says, it is significant to note that both men and women were free to exercise ministry. This is talking about this passage. Both could pray or prophesy. Either a woman or a man could do that, but it was very important how they did it. This is the emphasis that the passage makes. They must do it in two different ways, a male as a man and a woman as a woman. That's the central emphasis of the text. And I'm sorry, I got another quote by him later that he talks about the hats. I got that ahead of me. But it seems so logical and so sensible as he lays this out, it's almost hard that anybody would take issue with it. You might say, well, what's your problem? I mean, he's just saying that, all he's saying is that he's not saying that that women can't do anything in ministry. He's not saying that. He's not saying that women are insignificant in the home. He's not saying that. He's not saying that women are less or inferior in either one of those roles. He's not saying that. He's just simply saying it's a matter of structure. And to me, that seems so logical and sensible that I don't understand how somebody could take issue with it. But yet for almost the last 60 years in our culture and society, it's been in turmoil over this very issue, right? It began with the civil rights, the women's rights movement back in the 60s. And then from the women's liberation movement, it kind of morphed into the sexual orientation thing about, whether you had the right to choose what your sexual orientation was going to be, and homosexual rights and that sort of a thing. And now the whole American dream of you can be whatever you want to be has been taken to these unparalleled levels of absurdity, where you can just identify with whatever sex you want to be. And I put up this graphic about there's an egg shortage because the roosters are identifying as hens. Does that make me a woman because I say I'm a woman? Does that make me, can I identify as a young, pretty 20-year-old woman? Is that going to work? How far is that going to get me in culture? I mean, if we just look at it rationally, how did we get here? And there may be somebody here that's thinking, well, no, that's the way that works. It's if you think you're a man, you're a man. It doesn't matter what your biology is. If you think you're a woman, that's okay. You can identify whatever you want to identify with. No, you can't. You can't identify with whatever you want to do. You can't identify with what race you are, what color skin you have. You can't identify with your legal age or versus your minority. There's a lot of things that you can't just say, I identify with this and make it right because, your kids can't say, I identify as over 18 and so I can do what I want to. No, it doesn't work that way. He says, for a man, he continues, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But a woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. Okay, I'm going to pause long enough for the guys to wake up and break out their highlighters, because I'm sure you're going to want to highlight that verse. That was verse 9 that I just read. Man was created, nor man was created for the woman, but woman for the man. Okay, let me explain. or does that verse even need explanation? Can we just move on? Now, I said I would explain this whole helper thing earlier. Back in Genesis chapter 2, after God had made everything, he had all the animals. He made Adam, and he made all the animals go by Adam, 2 by 2, male and female. And he had them name them. Adam had to name the animals. And so he didn't just say horse. He said stallion and filly. You know, he didn't just say cow. He said bull and cow. You know, he named them by, they were brought by male and female, and so he gave them all their names. And as he's doing this, and by the time he got down to, you know, he started off with aardvarks, and by the time he gets down to zebras, he's noticing, because he's doing it alphabetically, he's noticing that there's only one of him. And so God says, it's not good that man shall dwell alone. I'm going to make a helper suitable for him. And this is in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. It's not good that man should be alone. I'm going to make a helper comparable to him. And this phrase, helper comparable to him, in the original language is the word etsen neged. And it doesn't mean, well, here's what it means. It means a completing counterpart. He looked at man and said, that dude's unfinished. You know, I mean, he needs to have something to complete him. And so he said, I know what I do. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a helper that will do that, a completing counterpart for him. The Old King James says helpmeet. And we have, in our culture over the years, we've taken those two words, helpmeet, and we put a hyphen in between it, you know, and we call it a helpmeet. You know, this is my helpmeet. Yeah, my helpmeet's going to be here in a little bit, you know, and that just sounds, to me, I mean, maybe it doesn't sound like you, but to me that sounds condescending. I would never call my wife my helpmeet. In the Old King James, what that means is, the word meet there, it's not M-E-A-T, it's M-E-E-T, and what it means is, it's a verb that means necessary. I'm going to make a helper that's necessary for him. That's what the word meet meant back in 1611. And so as we look at the word in modern translations, a helper comparable to him, or a helper who will be a completer for him, is a good understanding. You know, since my childhood, two of the most perennially popular toys have been G.I. Joe and Barbie. And it's been that way for, like I said, since I was a child. Been that way for about 2 or 3 decades now. And in a few weeks, in California, on January 1st, it was a law that was passed about 2 years ago, and their car salesman-in-chief, Governor Newsom, signed it into law, and it goes into effect on January 1st. And the law says that all department stores like Target, Walmart, those kind of places, they are all going to have a section that is identified as gender-neutral toys in their toy departments. They can't just have gender-neutral toys. They have to have a section that is identified as gender-neutral toys. I mean, we've had gender-neutral toys all along. You know, we've had skip ropes, jumping ropes, Uno. You know, we played Operation when I was a kid. You know, we've had gender-neutral toys all along, but now they have to have it in a section that is identified as that, because, as the law says, it's confusing to consumers when they try to buy toys for their children. Now, this isn't going to be the end of Babs and Joe, okay? It's called California Assembly Bill 1084. And this isn't the end of them. They're not taking G.I. Joe and Barbie off the shelf. But they're not taking Barbie and G.I. Joe off the shelf yet. But I think as we have seen the progression of things over the last several decades, I think we don't have to go to college to understand where it's going to lead to. And it says, for this reason, this is verse 10, for this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. You know, when I was preparing for this passage, I probably read more commentaries on this passage and listened to more teachings than any other teaching that I can remember doing. And this verse is one of the reasons. You know, I mean, this whole section is kind of difficult to parse out. It's kind of difficult to break down. I admit that. But when I get to this verse, and for this reason, the woman is supposed to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And so I read a bunch of commentaries, and what I found out is nobody knows what that means. You know, none of the commentators know either. But maybe I can shed a little light on possibly what Paul is thinking. Paul doesn't say anything more about this. He just says this and then moves on like we should know. You know, we saw earlier back in chapter 4 where Paul said that he and other apostles were being put on display as a spectacle before the world and also the angels. And the word spectacle there is the word theatron. They were put on as a theater, as a presentation before the world and the angels. So we had a little bit of introduction to the concept anyway about something being done for the angels back then. And in 1 Peter chapter 1, it says, he talks about how the Old Testament prophets, they gave these prophecies, especially the ones about Jesus and the Messiah and what he was going to accomplish. And they gave these prophecies, and they were even blown away by their own prophecies. You know, they had these prophecies, and they were going, wow, what does this mean? You know, and how is this what's this going to look like? And they were looking at, the Messiah and how God was going to condescend into humanity, become a man, and the gospel message, how God would do that, and then he would, as a man, he would take our place in judgment, and how he would be judged for our sins as though he committed them himself, and that he would be sentenced to death because of that, and the death that he died would be our death, and then he would, because he was sinless, he would defeat death, and he would rise from the dead victoriously. And then because of that, he would ascend to the Father in a glorious way, and then promise that anybody who bows their knee before him could become born again and receive without limit God's grace and mercy. I know I just spit out a lot there in that run-on sentence, but for the angels, that was just like, wow. You see, the Bible says that angels were created to be ministering spirits. In other words, they were created to be God's servants. They were the reason why God made angels is to go do his bidding. You know, whatever God wanted them to do, then they would go do it. And don't have time to get into the fallen angels and all that sort of thing, but we're just for the sake of the good angels, we'll just talk about the unfallen, the good angels right now. They were told to do things, and they did it because they understood an authority structure. The authority and the head and the servant relationship was not foreign to them. That's what they were created to do. But the grace and mercy thing, that's not anything they ever experienced. And so they were very intrigued by that. When they saw that God would be able to pour out his grace upon us who killed him, were responsible for his death, who are sinners worthy only for God's judgment, And that God, because he loved us so much, he came and took our place in judgment. And then he just gives us grace. Where sin abounds, there's grace and superabundance, Paul says. And the angels are looking at it and they're going, whoa, I need to check this out. I need to look at this closer. I need to examine this. And because it was really blowing their minds, And so it appears as though that they are wanting to observe Christians to see how we respond to his gift of salvation. I wrote in free gift of salvation in my notes, and my word checker flagged that. And it says, don't say free gift because all gifts are free. And so, if Microsoft understands that, we should, He gave us this gift of salvation that takes our sins as far as the east is from the west, recreates us into the image of his Son, Jesus, so that when he looks at us, he sees his Son. And so as he is well pleased with his Son, he's well pleased with us. And so we get his grace without merit, without limit, without any measure. And angels are saying, I want to see how those guys respond to that. I want to see if it's true that grace and mercy is better than rules and regulations. I want to observe that, because they know what it means when it says to do this and then they go do it. Don't do this, they don't go do it. But the grace and mercy thing, they want to check this out. Now, if we bring this passage down into the home with the husbands and the wives and their roles and so forth, God can make, if he wanted to, he could make the husbands love their wives sacrificially, so sacrificially that they will willingly and joyously submit to them. He could do that, but he didn't, because he wanted to use grace and mercy as our he wanted that to be the gas in our tanks. He wanted that to be our motivator for loving him and for serving him, not because he's making us, but because we want to. That's what love does. Love responds to love. And he wants that to be the thing. And the angels are just kind of checking this out. And so he could have done that, but he didn't. He chose a better way. And so I think that's probably where verse 10 fits in. But in verse 11 it says, nevertheless, neither a man is independent of woman, nor a woman independent of man in the Lord. In other words, as Christians, in the Lord this is the case. As woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. As I said earlier, priority and ranking do not mean inequality. It's nothing can be further from the truth. Alan Redpath, who was another guy of a generation before me, but one of my great heroes in the faith, he says this about this passage. A man who can only rule by stamping his foot had better remain single. But a man who knows how to govern his house by the love of the Lord, through sacrificial submission to the Lord, is the man who is going to make a perfect husband. I don't hear the gal saying amen. Okay, all right. Oh, that's not the end of it. The woman who cannot submit to an authority like that had better remain single. But isn't that true? I mean, isn't that exactly what this is all about? He says, judge among yourselves, verse 13. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her, and her hair is given to her for a covering. Now, the word nature here in verse 14, it's the word phusis, and it kind of has the same meaning as our English word nature. I mean, it doesn't always mean like leaves and dirt and insects, but it can mean a lot of things. And here, what it means is what normal or what is proprietous, how things should be. Doesn't nature tell us these things? And a case could probably be made that for the majority of the church, for the last 2,000 years, for the majority of these 2 millennia of the church's age, a case could be made that there's been more of as we look at the complementarian versus the egalitarian, there has been more of a complementary to the point of excess view of the church. Complementarianism, so much so that in many instances in the church's history, there was nothing complimentary about it, or complimentary about it. It was just the guy's job to, especially with the church, the guys did all the work, and women were just to go to church and be quiet and curtsy and genuflect and do things like that. And a case could be made for that, I think. And so much so, as we look at that in the last several decades, if we go back another 50, 60 years or so, there's been such a move to try to correct that the pendulum has swung clear to the other side. And I think the case could be made that too is excessive. As is often the case, I think the truth can be found in a balance between the two extremes. And just because one side has erred doesn't mean that we balance it out by erring on the other side. Now, y'all been waiting for me to get to long hair versus short hair. Now, for those of you that have come to the church within the last, let's say 2 months, 3 months, how many of you would say I have long hair? You've been here longer than that. How many that started coming to the church a year or so ago thinks that my hair is still long? It's a lot shorter than it was a year ago, and so let's just talk about long hair versus short hair. If you go and look in culture about, we don't have any pictures of Jesus. I don't know if that comes as a surprise to you, but they didn't have selfies back then. But if we look at pictures of Jesus pre-1960s, he always looked generally like the guy on the left, long hair and a beard. And then after the counterculture movement with the whole long hair thing that came sweeping through the world, the pictures of Jesus in churches, all of a sudden, he started having short hair because they wanted to make a case for having short hair versus long hair based upon what this passage says here. And so you got the pre-60s Jesus and the post-60s Jesus in our culture. And then, I remember when I was in school and we were studying music theory, and you had long-haired music, which would have been Beethoven and all those guys, versus long-haired music, which, would be Michael Bolin, and 80s Michael Bolin. But Michael Bolin was anything but countercultural. He was a housewife's dream, there was nothing revolutionary about him, but he had long hair. Because it wasn't a thing by the 80s. It was a thing in the 60s and 70s, but by the 80s it was not even stylish. Except Michael had it, and the housewife swooned, But then let's look at a picture of George Custer on the right and Boy George on the left. Now, do you think anybody ever came up to General Custer and said, "Can't tell the difference from the boys and the girls"? Maybe once, but at least for the 80s Boy George, I can't take issue, For him, not so much. When he's talking about this issue, and the whole thing about doesn't nature itself say this, I don't... I think what he's talking about here is the subject of propriety. What's right? And in his culture, in the Greco-Roman culture that Paul was addressing there in Corinth, men wore short hair. In the Jewish culture, they didn't. But then, how long is long and how short is short? You know, some of you guys that wanted to raise your hands a minute ago had got a lot longer hair than Bruce over here, you know. And so what is the standard for that? How do we determine that? Is that even what Paul is talking about here? Is that the issue? Is the length of somebody's hair? You know, it says for a covering, and the word for there is the word anti, and doesn't mean anti, but what it means is instead of. So the long hair has been given to the wives or to the women instead of a covering, or for a covering is the idea of it. So should the women be wearing head coverings in church? Some think so, some don't. But I can tell you this. If it's a matter of hair length, I've seen an awful lot of non-submissive, long-haired women in my life. I don't think that can really become a standard. Does that even mean anything in our culture today? The length of a woman's hair. Does that have any bearing today at all? You know, in Deuteronomy 22, I think Deuteronomy 22:5 does a pretty good job of the Lord nails it here, where he says, a woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment. For all who do so are an abomination to the Lord our God. Now, for us to really understand this passage, where it says that men shouldn't put on women's clothes and women shouldn't put on men's clothes, remember that back then, men wore dresses, right? You know, they all had these robes that went all the way down to the ground. I mean, they wore maxi skirts, but there was a difference in the way that they dressed, because the Lord addresses that here. He says, don't dress up, guys. Don't dress up to look like women, and women don't dress up to look like guys. It's not saying that women can't wear blue jeans and T-shirts. I'm not saying that, but there shouldn't be a confusion of the sexes because of the way you dress. I think that would be what the Lord is saying here. And as I said earlier, when I got ahead of myself with Ray Stedman, in the 50s, it was a thing whether women should wear hats or not. And then by the 60s, that had been kind of, as a fashion statement, as the way women dressed, it was kind of falling by the wayside. And so a lot of the church was up in arms about it and saying that because women have always worn hats in church and they need to wear hats in church because 1 Corinthians 11 says that women should have a covering. And so Ray Stedman addresses this where he says, it has now become a question, not so much of women wearing hats in church, but whether they're going to wear the pants at home. And I think that's the issue. That's the thing. When the Bible says that it's the man's role to be the head of the home, that does not mean that it's the man's role to be the boss. And I might ruffle some feathers here with some, I don't know if guys have feathers, but I might do that with some of the guys. I don't think that means that when God said that you're to be the head of the home, that means that you're to be in charge of the home. That you're not the boss. It doesn't mean that you make decisions independently of your wife and that she just has to go along with it because you're the head of the home. When the Bible talks about the man being the head of the home, it's saying, I want you men to be the guy that represents me in the home. We can say that you could be like the pastor or the priest of the home. If your wife and your children have any wonder what Jesus looks like, they should look to you, because you should exemplify that in all ways. That mantle, that responsibility, I think, has been laid on us as the dudes. I don't think that it means that we can make decisions independently of them. I don't mean, there's nothing like that. Well, I'm supposed to submit to you, so if you want to go buy that Lamborghini, go ahead. You know, no, it doesn't mean that. But what it does mean is that we are to represent Christ in the home. It's my heart that needs a haircut. Okay? And for the women, it's their heart that needs a head covering. That's the important thing. But he closes with, if anyone seems contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Well, that's another verse we don't have to comment on, right? Is it easy? As I said, this is a difficult passage. It's probably the most difficult passage, I think, for me to teach in the Bible is these 16 verses. Where he says, if anyone wants to be contentious, the word here is philonekos, and it's two Greek words, philos, which means love, and Nike, which was the Greek god of victory. And Nike tennis shoes take their name from that. And so it means a lover of victory. And so if anyone wants to be the one that always wins the argument, they want to take me to the issue on this thing, we don't have anything to say. That's basically what he's saying. If anyone seems to be contentious or seems to be a lover of victory, we don't have a custom, we don't have a rule, we don't have anything that says it should look like this or it should look like that. Nor do the churches of God. Warren Wiersbe kind of summarizes it this way. He says, how does the matter of wearing hats and wearing short hair apply to us today? While we do not have all the same circumstances that Paul had to deal with in Corinth, we must admit that a woman or a man out of place is always a hindrance to the work of God. There ought to be modesty in the local church, both in dress and in action. We dare not conform to the world lest we lose our testimony. And I think if we just take what Dr. Wiersbe was saying in that paragraph and apply it to these 16 verses, we won't go wrong. So God, we just thank you. We come before you right now. We bow in your presence, and we thank you for your grace. We thank you for your mercy. Lord, we thank you that there's forgiveness for the mistakes that we made. And I know there's probably a lot of people here this morning that don't agree with everything I said, and that's okay. It seems the way that it's written that there is room for that. It would seem that that's okay. But I think we would all have to agree with the heart of it. And so for that, Lord, let us be on one page and let us strive to have that modesty and propriety worked out in our homes and within our church life. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.